Hi, everyone. We'll just give everyone a minute or two before we start to allow all attendees to come through from the waiting room. Hi, everyone. This is Chris Lethbridge from the China-Britain Business Council, and it's great to have you all online for today's webinar, Creative Opportunities in China with Paul French and Jo Lusby. Before we begin, I have a couple of quick housekeeping items to mention. So please note this session will be recorded and a private link will be made available to all attendees post-event. If you would like to submit any questions, please do so using the Q&A function on your screens. We'll be posing these questions to Paul and Jo towards the end of today's webinar. So for today's webinar, we're lucky to be joined by Paul French and Jo Lusby. Paul French lived and worked in Shanghai for many years, and his book, Midnight in Peking, was a New York Times bestseller and a BBC Radio 4 Book of the Year of the Week, to name just two awards it won. He also writes regularly for the BBC Radio, Audible Originals, and is a regular contributor to CBBC's Focus magazine. Both Midnight in Peking and The City of Devils are currently being developed into a television in Beijing and LA. And he's also an executive producer of a UK, China, Australia co-production set in Macau and Shanghai, based on his own short story. Jo Lusby is co-founder of Pixie Bee, an independent consultancy and agency specializing in publishing film and the creative sector in China. And the company works with organizations and individuals seeking strategic and commercial advice, as well as negotiating partnerships and agreements for a wide range of IP brands. Clients include Pottermore, the Blair Partnerships, BBC Studios, the Financial Times, the Publishing Association, and others. Prior to founding Pixie Bee, Jo was North Asia CEO of Penguin Random House from 2005 to 2017. And in this role, Jo set up and managed local operations across Asia, establishing market-leading, award-winning local publishing house businesses in English, Chinese, and Korean. Jo also serves as the director of the Hong Kong International Literary Festival. So for today's webinar, Paul and Jo will spend the next roughly 40 minutes discussing some of the opportunities and challenges for the creative industries in China. And for the last 15 or so minutes, I'll also be putting your questions to Jo and Paul. So please do make use of the Q&A function. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand over to Jo and Paul.
Hi, hopefully that's everything. I'm muted and video on, and Jo too. Hi, Jo. Good to see you. Okay, this basically is a kind of, we had a session that we were asked to do last year for the Hong Kong Chamber of Commerce, British Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong. And it went quite well and seemed to be quite well received. So China-Britain Business Council asked us if we'd have another go. And a lot's happened since when was that? November. So here we are. And I think at the time we may have, rashly said, well, next year, we'll get back to lots of different projects. And that didn't. Obviously, we all know the situation we're in different countries here, as well as in China and Hong Kong and the region. I think also we were quite happy to do it because I think that we felt that sometimes the creative sectors in its sort of widest sense sometimes are not always looked at as closely and as with as much excitement as perhaps they should be, given how much potential earnings they have for the UK, as well as their role as a soft power tool for the UK as well, which sort of helps everyone. So by lifting the creative industries, I think we always felt that, you kind of lift all British business and reputation as well. To give you an idea of the breadth of sectors we're talking about, I mean, we're talking about here in the UK anyway, 112 billion pound industry. You could argue that it's even larger than that in terms of what we're talking about. So, we're thinking about it in terms of publishing, we're thinking about it in terms of film and television development and production and sales. We're thinking of it in terms of audio, which is a sector we're going to talk about, which is a sort of new and exciting and very fast growing one at the moment. And of course, movie co-productions as well as selling in British films, British books, British stories to China. But I think also I'm thinking of it slightly wider, certainly in Jo's case, thinking of it in terms of franchise development and character developments and everything that she has done from her time at Penguin with, you know, British celebrity chefs through to characters like Peter Rabbit and so on and on from there. And she can talk about that. And I also think about it in terms of with co-productions and film and TV, the amount of CGI work, for instance, that's done in the UK. So there's any number of Chinese films that you may see and be quite wowed by the CGI and not realize that that was done actually in a basement in London or Manchester or somewhere here in the UK, because we're quite state of the art at that. And also around all of that, I should mention, because I happen to be in the middle of it at the moment, is the whole role for British finance industry and so on in securing bonds and financing and legal representation, agenting, and everything that goes with protecting copyright and ensuring the very complex deals that often involve 2 or 3 different territories, 2 or 3 different legal systems, 2 or 3 different medias, all being involved at once. So that's rather a lot to get on with. I think for us, all of this, whether you're talking about movies, TV, audio, books, whatever, it all starts with telling a story that hopefully everyone wants to listen to, but in this case, China particularly wants to listen to. Now, those could be our stories. They can be British stories. They can be stories that we think will appeal to a Chinese audience. They can be ones that nobody ever set out with the intention of appealing to a Chinese audience, but China has picked up massively. And I'm sure Jo can talk a little bit about the work she's been doing with the Harry Potter franchise. And I'm sure when J.K. Rowling was sitting in that famous cafe in Edinburgh writing the first book and getting all her rejection letters, she wasn't thinking, one day I will conquer China. But you know, that is kind of what's happened with Harley Potter. So yes, without any further ado, I suppose we should start. If it starts with stories, I think the thing to start off talking about is perhaps, you know, how we get those stories into China. And perhaps the most obvious way and the most common route is obviously through books, and thinking of that in terms of ebooks as well as hard print books. And obviously myself publishing with Penguin and with Jo when she was running Penguin North Asia, we had some success at that, and I think we learned a lot of lessons about that. But whether or not we can distill perhaps what Jo learned as a publisher and what I learned as an author. So Jo, do you want to go back to those heady days of just trying to sell big lumps of paper around China?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul. Well, you know, I think it's an interesting subject talking about the print publishing market in China, because it's still absolutely enormous. And it's still one of the more robust and dynamic publishing markets in the world on one metric. But on another level, it also feels like it can often be quite a little bit passive. That the print publishing market is increasingly following what is going on in other sectors, particularly film and television, and increasingly now audio, as Paul says. And that the excitement and the innovation isn't necessarily there in Chinese publishing. Paul was talking about the value of the UK creative sector. You know, the print publishing market in China is worth around £10 billion a year. And that doesn't include the ebook or the audiobook market. And so it's a really attractive marketplace. But I think then British and international publishers, or content owners, when they're looking to sell into China, it feels a little bit like you're playing the tables in a casino, where you might, you know, you won't lose necessarily, but you won't necessarily get very much. And then you hear about other people getting enormous advances or massive sales. And it can feel quite baffling in terms of how you tap into that. I would say that the print publishing market has had a rude awakening during COVID. The print market has grown, or the publishing market has grown 10% a year for the past 5 years, up to 2019. And then last year it fell 2% around for the year, which was a real shock for China. I think that it's recovered marginally in the final quarter, 0.25% growth. So, you know, this is a real issue now. The government places the publishing industry as central to its creative sector. It likes the film and the television and the audio and all of the other formats following on from publishing, partly because it is so closely and from their point of view successfully regulated. It gives them a first line of defense that allows them then to give a lot more latitude to online platforms, for example, for digital content, because they like to use the precedent of a print published presence to ease the way and avoid more onerous regulations on the digital side. So I think this question of how you get into the marketplace is really pertinent, because as Paul says, it all starts with stories and it all starts with the content. I mean, essentially there are state-owned publishers, there are private publishers, and there's a small handful of foreign publishers operating in the market. The state-owned publishers and the print publishers, there's around 400 state-owned groups, there's around 1,000 independently registered creative companies. And then there's probably, I don't know, depending on how you want to count them, probably about 10 to 20 serious international operations with some form of an outfit in China. The market is mostly managed by sub-agents when you're talking about British and international IP, meaning these are very competent and very wide-ranging agencies that will take lists from publishers or agencies and sell them on their behalf into the marketplace. I think what we tend to find, the clients that we're working with, for example, the likes of Harry Potter, they tend to be much more high maintenance, narrower lists of authors, and much more of a business development need for the content when it goes into the market. So we don't play the volume game, we do narrow silos. And I think sort of what I'm feeling as the market evolves and as it goes through this systemic shock after COVID, the market is also realizing that these narrow silos have to be ploughed much more carefully so that there can be new content coming through in the market to really give it a shake up. I think one final thought I have on sort of the general market shape in China is that over the past 5 to 10 years, all of the books in the bestseller lists have been classics of one form or another. They've been mostly published 10 years or more ago. Even things like the sci-fi blockbuster Three Body Problem, the first of those books was actually published in 2008, I think. So these are not new books in the market. And everybody keeps saying, oh, this is the latest thing, but actually it's a very conservative market. So, you know, if you have the content that naturally fits in the groove of what people are already looking for, then it's much easier to sell than to sell a breakout thing. But obviously then something breaks out and then it's good news for everybody.
Yeah, I think, you know, the deal that we did with a big press that was very interested in foreign publishers, foreign writers, but big names by and large. And I think, you know, kind of, I found myself on a slate with people like sort of, you know, on a par with sort of Simon Sharma and David Abulafia and Simon Montefiore and people like that, who I would of course not be on a par with at, you know, the Cheltenham Literary Festival, right? But because I have a particular niche of writing about China, there's obviously a lot of interest within the Chinese audience and within Chinese publishers for what I do. And because it's historical and tends to deal with, well, if you take Midnight in Peking that we worked on, you know, well, white people killing white people, it kind of didn't offend anyone at the censors. So that book, as did City of Devils, actually, which surprised me a bit more, went through without any censorship whatsoever. And I think that then, so you know, obviously that's the kind of authors that they're mostly looking for. And then there are the few people like me who happen to be, you know, foreign, but telling a story that China wants to see, which then attracts attention because it's coming at China from a slightly different angle and kind of, you know, grab some space, media space and so on for hopefully being informed and well researched, but also looking at the China's history from a slightly different angle that isn't how everyone mostly digests their history in China. So that's interesting. And also what we were able to do there, which I think is good in a British sense, is, you know, my Chinese editions have lovely covers that I think speak to Chinese audiences. I should have shown an example, but don't necessarily speak to a Western audience. But also, I think we were, despite all the limitations on foreign publishers, we were able to get that kind of the penguin, the actual penguin on the side of the book, which I think was really good, because it, you know, the for us in the UK, of course, that's a comfort brand and so on. But you know, in China and elsewhere, due to the work you've done, but due to the work, you know, the Penguin Group has done globally around the world, Penguin Random House now, that really also jumped out at readers as well, who were also sort of quite impressed to see the penguin on the side of a Chinese book, and was a good, I think, I mean, from my position as an author, has been a very good long-term relationship with those publishers that doesn't feel that different. And you know, I've had earlier relationships with Chinese publishers where it felt very odd, but this relationship has not, because they're a very sophisticated Chinese publishing house, because it's Penguin on the other side, which is a very experienced publisher, it hasn't felt very different to the relationships I have with publishers in New York or Sydney or wherever, you know, other foreign language authors, you know, or other foreign language publishers that I deal with. So, you know, and they've understood notions of media and book tours and creating events, and they're as good at it and as efficient at it as anyone else that I deal with, which sort of interests me. And on the instance of where is TV and film looking for their ideas at the moment in China, I mean, I was on a conference, a Zoom conference, just a couple of weeks ago. It was a sort of spin-off from the Pingyao Film Festival, and that was specifically on looking at internet fiction, which I know you've had an involvement in, and how they take more internet fiction to develop television series and to develop movies. And there's already, of course, a number of examples. So the traditional, you know, writing a script from scratch or buying a book and then adapting it as a script, there's a great feeling of looking at internet fiction, the particular world of internet fiction that people can be involved in, that's happening with film and TV. We don't see so much of that in the West. Those two routes of just a spec script or buying a book, optioning a book, sorry, and then developing it for film and TV are just kind of pretty much how 99% of things are done. In China, this internet fiction section in the middle is absolutely enormous.
Yeah, internet fiction is a curious one, because it's one of the reasons there isn't a functioning ebook market in China. Because if people want to read their content digitized on a handset, then they read internet fiction. It's really only hardcore readers, a real minority of the readership base, that will read an e-version of a print book. I still remember getting some feedback from early Kindle users on your book, Paul, who complained that the story of Midnight Peking was too slow at the beginning, because they were used to internet fiction when they read it as an ebook. And we did point out that there was a murder on page 1, and that maybe we couldn't make it any faster for the sake of the e-version. But it's why that you generally see ebook sales are really quiet. They're probably only about 5 to 10% of the print volumes, whereas in sort of English language, more mature markets, you'd see them much, much higher than that. The internet fiction space is mostly subscription. It's very much fast fiction. It feeds into what people currently want and what they're interested in. And because it's such a fast response cycle, the film and television companies love to license from them, because it really does reflect the instant moment, if you like. Books have ended up becoming sort of this important literature segment, which means it sort of becomes a lot more static. And what you now actually see is also book publishing that also parachutes off of internet fiction. Internet fiction will become successful, they'll be optioned as film or TV, and then they will actually they will get the original author or somebody else to then turn it into a novel, so they can do print publishing as well. So it tends to come on afterwards with the internet fiction. I think that's also why there is a good opportunity for international content in the market, because the dynamism of the market is coming from for publishers, is coming from this internet writing side, or it's coming from overseas. That's where they're getting their energy from. There's not a huge amount of energy from domestically bred long form narrative writing novelists, domestic novelists. It's really coming, as I say, from online. I think the censorship thing is an interesting one. You know, one thing I've learned in these years of doing this is never try and prejudge what they're going to stop you from doing or let you do. You know, we've had problems with things that you would never ever have expected. And then you've also had an easy ride with things that you can often think are sensitive. I think the real challenge, particularly if you're talking about non-fiction, is that the marketplace wants things to be relevant. But often the more relevant they are, the more difficult they are to successfully get out. So I'm really talking much more in adult terms than children's publishing. But there's two authors that we represent that are kind of perfect examples of the two sides of the story. One is a non-fiction book by a French non-fiction writer called Florence de Changy on MH370 disappearance that HarperCollins published 2 weeks ago, called The Disappearing Act. That's a book we would never try and sell into China because it's just too sensitive. It's about what this plane that was en route to Beijing and what was going on with this flight. We haven't even approached mainland publishers with this book, but another book by Stephen Schwankert on the 6 survivors of the Titanic, we started with China because it felt like a story that was just so directly relevant to the Chinese readership that it would be a mistake to not lead with the China audience and then go and seek publishing opportunities for that title overseas. Doing the China first approach on certain titles when they are of direct relevance is a really exciting way of doing this, because the Chinese publishers love it. They then get to sort of claim it as an export win, even though the book was kind of exporting itself and putting itself on a plane. But there's this sense of, sort of this market was taken care of. It was considered first and foremost above other languages, that this is a market. Again, readers want relevance. Readers want something to feel important and interesting to them. Basically it takes a lot of advocacy for the text. If you are going to try and get these non-fiction books into the market, it takes a lot of careful advocacy with the potential publishers to help them understand where the flashpoints and the risks might be.
Yeah, I think moving on to how you adapt things with China is sort of an interesting one, because we're also in a kind of great state of flux there at the moment. I have a script that's with the censors right now, and I'm just waiting to see what comes back with it. And I'm not anticipating any great problems. I mean, not with the script itself, with the wider world of politics that could feed into whether or not they like the idea of who's involved in it is a different thing. But and that's a problem that that faces, and as you say, it's constantly changing all the time as to who might be a problem and who might not be a problem. But in that case, it was also with a project which is about Shanghai Jewish refugees and those few that went to Macau and how they became involved in some resistance, helping British and Australian soldiers who got out of Hong Kong to escape and get to Chongqing, which of course was the Chinese capital at the time. Anyway, so it's based on a true story, but it's kind of got a lot of, when we pitched it as a Sino-UK Australian co-production, it got a lot of traction in China because, of course, it was around the time Rana Mitter has just written a whole book about this, of our China's relationship with how it understands the World War II, how it positions itself as an allied nation alongside Britain and America and so on. And it spoke to all of that. So there wasn't necessarily anything for anyone to get annoyed about. But what was interesting to me was that, which I hadn't fully appreciated, was, that we have so much discussion about the quota on films. So obviously people are making films, and there's lots of things that China will sort of buy straight off the bat because they're not going to be a problem. So, I don't imagine if you've just made Paddington 3, you're going to have a great problem selling it to China. Cartoons, a lot of stuff like that. Feature films, if they're not just sort of, superhero type things, have a lot more problems around them. But this one was interesting because it's a co-production, it therefore has a strange relationship with the quota. So one of the investors, if you like, is a guy who describes himself as running China's Curzon Films. He'd been in the UK and seen Curzon, the cinema chain. And of course, when he said, well, we're China's Curzon, I thought, like, okay, so I had a picture in my head of what it was. Independent cinemas showing slightly different films, showing a lot of documentaries, showing things that, wouldn't be the big blockbuster hits. Of course, Curzon has about 12 cinemas around the UK and is fantastic. But of course, he's China. So China's Curzon has 700 screens. So what he's basically able to do is not necessarily to invest money into a film. That money can come from the UK, it can come from Australia, and it can come from elsewhere, both in the terms of grants and lottery funding and individuals. But what he's doing is basically saying, as part of the whole package, which also encourages investors, is, I will show this on my 700 screens. I like this film. I believe in this film. Now, of course, we could make an absolutely awful film, and he wouldn't want to show it anywhere, or we could also fall foul of the censors at some point. But the idea that it at least is going to get 700 screens is kind of, and then an international deal that you do separately to show it at whatever cinemas you're going to show it at in the UK, the US, Europe, wherever, streamers, is enough. That power in the market is enough to help us get lots of, well, hopefully, financing on board elsewhere. And that's not a problem. It's just everyone's waiting now for the censor, whoever he or she is, to say what they think. So I think that weight in the market for co-productions and so on, of just, we have a massive number of eyeballs we can show this to, and that there's a way of doing that, not like the old days when I was sort of in the market research business, Rupert Murdoch's famous 2 billion eyeballs, when he was going to get Baywatch on TV and Star Asia was going to get into China. That structure didn't work. But this idea of Chinese-owned cinema chains able to work at a very early stage, at draft 3 of a script, which is probably going to go through another 30 iterations, but draft 3 of a script stage to involve a cinema chain in China in the production of that film and the raising the finance for that film is kind of something that I think is quite new.
And Paul, can I ask you, in terms of this journey from print to screen that you're going on with various of your books and your works in China, how would you say the landscape has changed over the past 2 years? I think not only have we had the shock of this past 12 months where all the cinemas being closed, everything being put on hold and all the rest of it, but also prior to that, big shake-up in the industry in China around tax and around pay and around salaries and all of that kind of thing, that actually in some ways collapsed in a lot of the normal sources of funding. Are you finding people are not as willing to fund or more interested to fund? I mean, now China's sort of heading into sort of recovery mode, if you can call it that. Where does this question of financing and appetite for investing stand for film?
Well, for me, I've seen it in 2 ways. I mean, one is just there's a lot of people with a lot of money in China, and in the same way as some people like to take the money they've made, however, and put it into art or put it into something that they like in the hope of a return. Film is one of those things, right? Which of course has always been the case in the West. You've always had people who made money selling tins of beans wanting to become Hollywood producers, right? And you've got a similar thing like that in China, often silent. I mean, just, this is one way I have a fund of money and this is one thing I'd like to invest in. Often actually very helpful. So Chinese investors that we've spoken to actually have lots of ideas around directors and cinematographers and people like that. And I think they're not that kind of, like you might think from sort of bad films about films of, I'll invest in your film, but, you've got to cast my girlfriend in the lead or something like that, kind of get shorty type of approach to film. But actually, they are people who love cinema and film and television and have been involved in this and know people and can make that introduction to a director and introduce you to a director or a cinematographer, which is interesting. I think also the other thing that's really important is there are Chinese directors, particularly at the moment, auteurs, if you like, who are thinking outside of the box in terms of how they make films and where they make films for. So in a sense, you can argue that Chinese film has become less international in that, because of things going on in the wider political culture, lots of films that are not getting made or getting very limited or not released at all, not being entered for international competitions and so on. On the other hand, there's a space now for, lots and lots of people who didn't used to be able to really access Chinese films are now looking at Chinese films on Netflix and on Amazon, and Netflix, Amazon and other streamers, like Curzon, BFI and others like that, are actively seeking out niche Chinese content, which might be quite mainstream in China, but isn't something that we've seen here normally, unless you happen to live around, a metropolitan area with a cinema that may show these things for a couple of nights. And what I find is also interesting there is that some of these Chinese directors, production companies, and acting talent are looking at the streamers, and they're looking at what's going on. Netflix, Amazon, all of these people working around Asia, but they're also looking at ones within China that are starting to reach out a little bit, like kind of, you know, iQIYI and things like that, which you can have on your iPad in the UK and watch a lot of Chinese television on. And if you're thinking about writing for a Chinese market, you better watch a lot of that stuff. They're thinking about, you know, how do I do a Netflix show? How do I do that? How do I bridge that market coming from the other way? And of course, you know, that's one where Midnight in Peking is kind of being developed with that kind of idea in mind, of a sort of a bridge product. Not we're doing a Western film that might be of interest to a Chinese audience, but hopefully to a Western audience as well. But one that from the start tries to build in both, because the story naturally has all those elements in. And at the same time, we've got Chinese television going through a kind of a great big shakeout. You know, aside from censorship, is this idea that, you know, what the Chinese regulators want, and it's sort of unusual to us that a regulator should sort of say these sort of things, is we don't want 30, 40, 50 episode shows. We want to go more like Netflix or the BBC or whoever, and go to, you know, 8, 10, 12 episode shows. And that's been a real boon for Western scriptwriters, UK and American scriptwriters, who've often been brought in to help out. There's a great show that you can see on iQIYI, actually, if you go there, called Bad Kids in English. And it's a kind of group of slightly underclass kids who end up in a murder thing. It's 12 episodes. And one of the guys who was one of the script editors on House of Cards, you know, the American House of Cards, the Kevin Spacey one, was brought in to work on that, because all of a sudden you've got script writers who were looking really at soap operas, right? And thinking about how to extend and extend and extend, which, going back to internet fiction, is obviously a way that you just keep rolling with internet fiction, whereas a book ends on page 350 and then it might be part of a trilogy, but that's the only way it can work. All of a sudden you've got to have that punch and that fire and that lift across 12, 13 episodes that grab people. And of course, that's a format we're very, very familiar with. And it's one that Chinese writers have not always been. So there's a learning curve going on there, where Western writers are being, you know, from the very basic of just being hired to script edit, through to people looking for that kind of content in a way that we naturally think of when we devise a TV show.
I think that regulatory involvement in content is a really interesting and quite a nuanced thing. I think people think of regulatory involvement as just sort of a very blunt instrument that comes in. It's just the swinging axe that just sort of chops things off at the knees. I mean, the reality is, as you say, there's, you know, regulatory involvement in terms of there's been a significant reduction in ISBNs made available in the market, because they felt that there was too much poor quality publishing going out the door, and that there should be fewer books published. Actually, when I first joined Penguin back in 2005, I remember that was the mantra of the company back then, was we want to publish fewer books better. You know, focus our resources on doing things really well rather than trying to do a huge amount. So what they want to do is actually a very normal part of a sort of a commercial process. But this is very much led by the government, and it has seen a lot of rights agents complaining that ISBNs are not available to the level to which they would like to see. I have to say, I've not experienced books being turned down in the market because of lack of ISBNs. What I've tended to find is publishers are now prioritizing. So it's the people trying to sell large lists of content, and maybe finding that some of the smaller books, or some of the less high profile titles, or the ones where they just feel as though there's not a good enough reason to get it out in the market, those are the ones that are now going to be harder to sell. I think we have had a bit of a bonanza over the past few years where you have been able to sell pretty much anything. Another area that regulators have gotten involved is this advising, as Paul says, you know, on how long a TV show should be, and how much you should be paying your talent, and how many episodes there should be, and what kind of quality and what kind of subject lines you should and shouldn't include. And this is a constantly evolving picture. It just regularly changes. Last year, the State Council, so the Chinese Cabinet Office, issued a statement encouraging the publishing of sci-fi. They decided that sci-fi is of the utmost importance to the Chinese state. And, you know, it's a huge priority for the government, I think, partly because the government, there's a lot of engineers up there who like this imagination backed by science. That's kind of what they're saying. There's a rationality to the fantasy, that they don't like irrational fantasy. They don't like things that are too trippy or too time travel-y or too nostalgic about the past. There's huge amounts of tripwire laid down. I think the best thing to do, though, is you can't focus on what they really, in these narrow senses, you can't hope to walk a path through the preferences. But what you can do is, if, for example, you do have a good list of sci-fi, I think now is absolutely the time to be selling it. We haven't seen any meaningful sanction taken against British-based IP. Throughout my whole career of doing this, I found that UK IP generally actually sells slightly better than US IP, unless you're talking about the huge franchises from America that kind of sell themselves. Generally speaking, I think British publishers and British content companies are temperamentally better suited to selling to China because they need the export market. The international market is a core market for them, whereas you often find for American publishers and IP companies that overseas can be kind of gravy. It's a nice thing to have, but it's not essential to make a profit in the same way as it is for UK. So it means that British businesses generally are more open to being flexible, making changes, adapting, looking at different formats, different pricing models, and having a much more open-minded approach to the market. We have seen significant disincentives to publishers wanting to publish books from US authors, but that's never 100%. Oftentimes the publishers just want a different way to describe a book, and then the question of their nationality just doesn't come up. Whereas, we've not seen that at this point with the UK, but you can't rule it out. I mean, we're sort of one news cycle away from something coming out of the clear blue sky. In the US trade sanctions, though, publishing was a lot further down the line. It was not in the first line of things that were sanctioned against when that all came in. That got shut off quite early on, and it's sort of reopening, but the fundamental relationship, I think now it's a habit. People are reluctant to buy the American titles, and they don't need to. They can buy UK titles, and they can fulfill their demand. So, it's definitely a consideration. I think the only final thing I would say on the regulatory side is that children's, it's one of the two categories that didn't fall last year in publishing terms. That was one of the ones that stayed stable in demand terms. But also it's the area the government knows that foreign children's content, and as again, particularly British children's content, is incredibly popular in China. And they hate that because they hate the idea that children are getting their moral compass and their stories and their narrative from overseas. So they're constantly, it's never quite restrictions, but there's always talk about how can they reduce the amount of foreign children's content, and that's going to be something that if it does turn into a real thing, then it's going to become it's going to hit the UK in terms of IP sales into China.
I think it's worth mentioning as well. I mean, I have what you say about whether you go with science fiction or detectives or whatever is for people like me that are sometimes trying to craft something that can appeal to both audiences and look at maybe an international streamer taking that on with a Chinese partner, which is something the big international streamers are looking to do. If you think of a Netflix or someone like that Netflix China exists, but of course there isn't a Netflix China that you can subscribe to, but there are ways of trying to work with this. And I've looked in the past, well, COVID rather interrupted it, but with a series that was featuring both UK and Chinese characters, that was also a historical detective series. And now that feeds into what you were saying of detectives are great, but not kind of run around shooting up everywhere necessarily, right? Much as we might like that ourselves, they tend to the regulators anyway tend to want things that are sort of crimes that are solved with brain power and Sherlock Holmes, right? And that's my point, that we're also building on the success of British product that was designed for British audiences. So the success of the Mark Gatiss Sherlock, the one with Cumberbatch, has been immense, and several other series as well, but particularly that one, which feeds into a long tradition of love of Sherlock Holmes. In about 1991, 92, I was in Beijing at that time setting up a market research company, and we bumped into a Chinese company that had a lot of statistics that we wanted. And it was very rough and ready then. They had no idea of the value of it. We were trying to do a licensing deal, and it was that they were sort of quite naive about how to do that. We were totally naive, being two sort of like recent graduates from England. So we didn't know what we were doing. And the fact that we wouldn't even get that meeting now, but we did then. And one of the only reasons we got that meeting was that the guy who owned all the content wasn't really interested in the content. What he was interested in was Sherlock Holmes. And he happened to be the chairman of the Beijing Sherlock Holmes Society. And I don't even know if this still exists. And he was very, very keen to get going on Sherlock Holmes. And this was this sort of weird thing that he had in his life. Not the weirdest thing, because he was also a mad Crystal Palace Football Club supporter, which is a very strange thing to be. But and then so we went back to England. And then when we came back, I popped around to the Sherlock Holmes Museum on Baker Street and bought what at those times were very popular items like mouse mats and those little fuzzy things that used to stick on the screen of your computer. And I always Sherlock Holmes, and I took all that back. And I'm sure that's what got us the first deal that got the ball rolling on that. So there's long traditions of liking these people. And in fact, it was a British team that came in and wrote the Judge D series that aired over there, which of course is, about I'm going to get this wrong now, Ming Dynasty, Tang Dynasty, judge who moves around China, but of course was written by a Dutch sinologist, Robert van Grulik, and then they brought in an English team to write it, given that you want 60-minute episode, and crime happens, crime solved, we go out next week, you do another crime. It was a format we were very familiar with, they weren't so, and that worked very, very well. So there's a great base to build on, and it's not just, it is kids shows that have done extremely well, it's Attenborough and the nature stuff that's done really, really well, as well as not just the BBC and so on, but National Nat Geo and other people, Discovery and other people like that who have non-sensitive topics. So trying to do bridge productions is also us trying to move on to, there is already a base of stuff that audiences are familiar with that we can move to. Every single project I have in China for film and TV, doesn't matter what period it is, doesn't matter what it is. The first thing that everyone in China will say is, can you get Dominic Cumberbatch to be in it, right? Who also I know makes a fortune advertising various appliance brands in China as well. So the exposure that these actors get is massive. We should talk lastly about audio, because audio is really ginormous and growing very fast. And I've been involved in a lot of audio, but you're very involved in the specific of Chinese audio market.
Yeah, for sure. Audio is a really exciting marketplace in China. The audio platforms are, the marketplace for audio in China is around £2 billion a year. So it's a fifth of the size of the print publishing market, but it's been growing at around 50% a year. I've been speaking with some of the major audio players in the past few weeks. They haven't released their 2020 data yet. But what they're saying is they all had a huge growth in listeners in the first quarter into the first half of last year, for the obvious reason that everyone was at home. It actually did tail off quite substantially towards the end of the year, which makes it actually a very interesting time for high quality IP sales to audio players, because they're very aware now that they've got a lot more people listening on their platforms, but that they're actually not, they need the better content to keep them loyal and keep them sticky. So it's a real acquisition marketplace right now for high quality content. The issue for a lot of UK based creatives is that you have to be open to quite a different model, both in terms of the format and in terms of the pricing models. None of the sites, Himalaya is the biggest, but none of the sites are audible for China in the way that they approach this content. For example, dramatized audio is significantly more attractive to them than single or multi-voice narration. They want it to be turned into a play if they're going to really reach the mainstream in audio terms. They also, the pricing model, as well as doing single title sales, which do exist, but it's mostly membership subscriptions, or it's people earning money through tipping. There's a lot of tipping. I was reading some of the recent data. What did I read? That the average audiobook listener spends basically the equivalent of about £80 a year tipping authors or narrators on audiobooks, in addition to the fees that they're paying for that audio. And it's also bundling, get a print book along with an audio book, get merchandise, get gifts, so lots of these big packages. So it's a very dynamic marketplace. The formats of the content, if you're looking at non-fiction, it's generally known as paid knowledge. That's where the real interest lies. Paid knowledge is basically a book that's turned into a course where you learn something. The learning is very soft. It can be inspirational as much as it's actually sort of transfer of knowledge. But this paid knowledge marketplace, what you have is these non-fiction downloads that are priced upwards of 300 RMB for a course of around 20 episodes. And they are, the very interesting part around the audio marketplace is that paid content has really existed since the get-go. So unlike with ebooks, which is competing with a lot of free content on the internet literature sites, on the audio side, you can actually sell a straight audiobook. If you're an author or if you yourself are not willing to accept any changes, there is a marketplace for straightforward audiobooks as well through these sites. But also there's this hugely dynamic sector where and it's all separate grants of rights. You can divide your rights up and license a single voice narration, and then you can turn around in a couple of weeks and order a different format if that's how you want to present your content in the market. So I have to say, for all that, the publishing market, the print publishing market is the best place to start with your content, because also audio does work on precedent in terms of censorship. So if the book has been published in print in Chinese or imported in English through an import agency, then you can directly license to that player. So, starting with the print definitely makes sense, but the audiobook is most definitely the most exciting part of my portfolio at the moment. And Paul, I think the same thing would go for you as well, right? I think that you're seeing an awful lot of dynamism and interest and sort of experimentation with your own audio work.
Yeah, I think so. Just finally, I think that, there's also a very low barrier to entry for companies as well in terms of getting your, it's sort of mental capital or whatever they call it, intellectual capital. And I think, there are companies out there who specialize in film. We have great companies in the UK like Glipper Media and so on, who are Group 8 and people like that, who are, in the film business. But there's an awful lot you have to know to be in the film business, right? There's a massive learning curve before whatever you know about China, you then have to go on another learning curve about film. And that's often the case with setting up a publisher as well. And TV, again, is its own world that you've got an awful lot to learn, even if you sort of understand China. With audio, I feel that the UK is so well positioned for audio. I just did for the BBC, the Peking Noir thing. Now, that is docudrama. And when that goes out on BBC Sounds, it's 2 hours, but broken into 6 episodes. And when that goes out on BBC Sounds internationally, the response, particularly from America, is incredible because they sort of lost their tradition of radio drama. You'd have to go back to Orson Welles or something to sort of see radio drama there. Here in the UK, thanks to the BBC, we maintained a massive and ever developing tradition of audio drama, classics, new works, docudramas like I've been doing, all sorts of stuff, and all the podcasts that you can see if you go on BBC Sounds. So every week on Radio 3, Radio 4, Sounds, you're getting all of this stuff coming at you, radio drama. So in the UK, people just sort of listen to it and they hear a cast of 20 people with sound effects and everything else and just think, well, that's what's on the radio all the time, right? In the rest of the world, that's just not the case. Radio is usually single voice or music, right? So it really is like suddenly, you've seen some silent movies and then all of a sudden you're shown Ben-Hur. It's like you could be epic on a scale and it can feel epic. And I think, but also in terms of, how good the UK has been with sort of education and intellectual things in China, how good we've been at really writing stories, telling stories, writing TV. This is an area where there are opportunities for companies to get in, and I think whether it's drama or training, intellectual, helping people with their careers, helping people with their knowledge base, helping people with language, all of this comes together. All of these have been very fractured markets and they all come together in this so-called ear economy. So I think for the UK, this is something that a lot of people could get into. And again, you don't have to have a massive budget to get up and running in this. Podcast companies are starting all over the place in people's bedrooms. It's very COVID friendly. listenership is off the scale. I know from, you know, my own stuff for radio, but also the numbers that you see from, that you're sort of allowed to see from the BBC. It's enormous. It's what everyone's listening to, and it's great across age range as well. I think we should move to some questions, because we've talked a little bit longer. And I think Chris is back to handle it.
Absolutely. Thank you both. It's been a really interesting conversation. So we've got a question from Jack Yu, who asked, and kind of picking up on this audio point, you know, how do you deal with language and translation in audio and book projects? In terms of, yeah, okay, Jo.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it depends in terms of what that relates to, but I mean, I mean, most of the platforms will do it. You can either license the original language to the platform and they will handle the translation and production work for you, or you can do it yourself and you can give them ready to go files. And it's just, then it's a sliding scale of how much money you get from them as a percentage, because if the platform is doing most of the work, then they're going to pay you a smaller percentage. If you're doing most of the work and they're really just distributors, then it can slide in that favor. I would also say that you can quite easily get into exclusive and non-exclusive agreements with the platforms. And they are open to both models. Obviously, again, it's just a different price. So if you want to produce yourself, there's some very good production studios in China. The one area where it feels as though the state system has pivoted quite neatly to the new age is in audio, where there's a lot of formerly sort of radio station production units who have great contacts in terms of voice talent, who offer their services in the market to do that production. So, and some clients want to pay up front to pay for that production themselves, and then they're taking the band, they own the edition and the version, and they can then take the majority. So it's a huge variety. The main thing is you have to monitor it really carefully. If you have to make sure that your brand is being presented in the way that you want it to in the audio space. You've got to have somebody really in a detailed sense following. This is what we do with our clients when we're doing audio, is that we have to follow very, very closely what's happening in production terms to make sure that the voice and the treatment and all of the rest of it is right for the given property.
Yeah, I think voices are really important. So I did an Audible original a couple of years ago called Murders of Old China, which was really a sort of 12 episode thing. Yeah, 12 episodes, 12 murders, really, an audio book. And it was narrated by me, and I seem to have got away with being able to do narration. But I must say, even though I get told by people at Audible or people at the BBC that it's okay for me to be in it, and when I first started doing this, I just figured I would be writing a script for someone else to read, but they sort of quite like it. And apparently for the BBC, North London counts as a regional accent, so I'm a tick in the box as well. But the interesting thing about that is, of course, you know, when you go to China, the voices are very, very different, and people are really, really picky about voices. If I look at the reviews of my Audible original, there isn't one criticism of the content, there isn't one criticism of the idea of it, but there are just lots of people, very hurtful people, I might say, who have comments about your voice all the way through, right? And you suddenly expose yourself, and you get a sense of what actors must feel, which you don't really get when you write books and just get, you know, comments on Amazon. Comments about your personal voice are quite, you know, so how actors deal with it about their looks, I don't know. So voices are there, and anyone who, of course, has spent any time in China and has used the radio as a great language tool and everything will know that the favored voices, the received pronunciations, and the tone that the voice is set at, the amount of bass it's given, the amount of reverb it's given, is very different to a voice you would hear on you know, reading the news on the BBC or so on. So but I also think you can do both, because there is an audience, depending on what you're doing, there is an audience that wants to hear it in English as part of their, you know, listening to native accents and so on. But you know, I think that we have to realize that I think there's a very, very specific, not just in terms of the actual language, but the levels the voice is recorded at, the tone of the voice as well. But that's easy to do, as Jo says, because there's so many people around who've worked in radio, worked in audio, and of course, China is full of actors.
So taking a bit of a different turn, we've got an anonymous question asking around the link between the creative industries or the creative sector and tourism. So, you know, China has overtook the US as the world's largest outbound tourism market in 2019. You know, what role do they play together?
Well, I can say that I'm finding that it's a very I've seen it the other way around at the moment. So at the moment, the project that I'm doing, that's a Sino UK Australian joint venture, the interest in Australia, apart from the fact that we want to do interiors there, so it's work for their studios, and you may know in a wider sense at the moment, because of its success with COVID, lots and lots of film and TV productions moving to Australia at the moment. But the tourism people there are really, really interested in investing and where you're going to do it. And you can actually, to a point, play states off against each other, right? Because you know, they have a lot of Chinese that go to Australia for education, for tourism and so on. And they want to create, even though you're not going to see much of Australia, they think of it in those terms. I haven't had those conversations with the UK at the moment, because for all sorts of reasons to do with changes in the UK in the last couple of years, we won't be doing any filming or bringing anything to the UK. But it is something that people should get into. It is something, you know, I mean, I think that one of the biggest funders for Vera on ITV and for the George Gently show on the BBC was the Northumbrian and Newcastle and Northeast tourism people, right? I don't know, I haven't yet had a conversation with a Chinese tourism board about whether or not, and this is something that I know, I have had this conversation in Macau and it did not go well. The idea that you might want to get involved in tourism because we're going to show lots of Macau, but the fact that there might be some people getting killed, they walk away from. Whereas, you know, in the UK, the tourism people have sort of identified with the idea that if it's going out on Sunday nights and it's a, you know, Vera or something like that, this is a really good way to showcase our region. I mean, the association of your region with, you know, one murder a week for 8 weeks isn't one that, at least in Macau, they've bought into yet. And I imagine that'd be quite a hard sell in China. But the Australians totally get it and are kind of very involved in that. China tourism going out, I haven't really experienced that.
I think the only experience I have on that was when I was with Penguin still. We had various companies approach us wanting to do the Penguin literary tour of Britain, and this kind of thing. I think there's a real opportunity in terms of outbound tourism. The package tour, if you like, has evolved in China, and there's a lot of middle class people who want a sort of fun for all the family kind of tour, where they go to all of these key sites associated with, you know, we put together a brilliant package for them of places that they could go to and see sort of book related, you know, locations around the UK. It never ended up actually happening. But there's lots of, I think there is definitely a sort of, if you have an interest in a part of the UK and there's a literary link, I think it is worth then sort of seeing what you can do in terms of presenting it as a destination in China. I think that's for sure. I think that's an established opportunity.
I should point out quickly, by the way, the Midnight in Peking walking tour is back up and running after a break over COVID. And that continues to be very successful. And what surprised me about that, I should also say that it's run by an excellent UK company based in Beijing called Bespoke Beijing. But what interested me about that was when we had a big push on the Chinese edition of the book a few years ago, and I happened to be in Beijing, we did the walk for Chinese audiences in Chinese as well. And that really was a revelation in that it was not a market where walking tours and things were quite as accepted as they are in the UK and America, and certainly sorry, not in dark tourism as it's called, right, where you know, which is like the Jack the Ripper walks or the murder walks you can do in Edinburgh or other places, and that is also now happening occasionally. It's sort of promoted by the publisher rather than as a business venture, but people are going on those kind of walks. So the sort of nature of wanting to explore locations and explore places is something that's definitely there. And the Chinese audiences that I've been around with really like that Midnight Peking walk, because it's mostly places in Beijing that even lifelong Beijingers haven't necessarily been to or thought about in those contexts. So yeah, I think there's that's one that if you're in Beijing, it's back up and running, and you should definitely do that walk. I feel like a bit of a pioneer on walks.
So look, unfortunately, we are out of time, and we do like to kind of keep our events to time. But Paul and Jo, thank you very much for that. It was a really great conversation around creative industries in China. We do have a kind of 1 or 2 questions left over, but I might post them to you kind of over email, and we can then respond to the question askers separately to this. I might take this last minute to just share some upcoming events for those who are interested. So we're running an event with the European Chamber looking at the US-China trade war. On the 25th of March, we're running an event around the Lianghui sessions in Beijing, and so what that means for UK business. UK-China Consumer Week, it's a week-long event looking at all things Chinese consumer. And then in April, we're doing a Beyond 100 Days to the Biden administration and the future of US-China relations. But Paul and Jo, thank you very much for that. That was a really, really great conversation. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Hope to see you soon, Jo.
Yep, see you soon.